All right. Um, I hope I hope everyone is having a good week. So today we'll kind of resume our series on the phenomenology of dating. So this is the number three, and today we're going to talk about. I know I titled it "Nice Guys Finish Last." Trope. There's going to be a lot of connection to this idea of the trope of nice guys finish last and several problems with the perverse enjoyment of the nice guy and then the perverse enjoyment of the archetype of the bad boy, so to speak. Um, so there there is a couple of things. One, I'm going to talk about the ground of attraction in this video that I ended up doing on my Substack, but I will kind of briefly introduce what I've discovered with the ground of attraction. The ground of attraction is not a matter of knowing what you're attracted to, because what you're attracted to, and this is the aporia of attraction, is that what you're attracted to can also be the very thing that doesn't sustain the attraction. So, for example, you may be attracted to women with a kind of aesthetically pleasing look, big breasts, big ass, and so on. But you will soon discover that this in itself doesn't sustain the attraction. So, in my opinion, dating has this epistemological certainty of like, I know what I'm attracted to, rather than asking this question of like, what what is it that sustains the attraction? Because even the aesthetic look of a person, even though it invites us towards attraction and it is what initially attracts us about a person, it doesn't guarantee the sustaining of the attraction. And why is that so? Why doesn't initial attraction in itself sustain the attraction? And the reason why that is because even if you find somebody physically attractive, we're somehow neglecting the contingency of time in which the person ages and grows older and their bodies change and our bodies change and so on. So it becomes this question of like, how does attraction sustain itself in the midst of combating the initial attraction? Because the initial attraction is actually the one feature that doesn't sustain the attraction, ironically enough. There has to be something, and this is what I'm going to propose, there has to be something that lacks. It cannot be something that is offered. It has to be something that lacks, that sort of sustains the attraction. What does this mean? We can look at the tropes of the common dating tropes of like the bad boy and the nice guy. Why does the nice guy finish last per se? Let's just put it that way. Why does the nice guy finish last? My theory so far has reached this point. The reason why the nice guy finished last is because he presents no risk. He presents no risk at all. He essentially, the nice guy is the guy that doesn't lack. And this, for women or other attracted partners, can find it boring, can find it like there's no substance there. Essentially, there is no lacking that feeds the attraction. Now, why is the bad boy the attractive option? The bad boy is the attractive option because he lacks, precisely because he lacks, right? The only thing that, and this is what sustains it, is that the woman, in hopes of kind of like being attracted to the bad boy, is that she hopes that she will find something that the bad boy actually lacks. What the bad boy actually lacks is his goodness, his commitment, and so on, whatever tropes we want to kind of associate or stereotypes that we want to associate, right? She is actually hoping that she can find a bad boy that also lacks, but in a different way. A bad boy lacking would mean that he displays some hope of redeemable qualities, that he can actually prove himself to be committed, that he doesn't cheat, that he doesn't play his partner, and so on, right? But the bad boy archetype, in some sense, always fails because the bad boy archetype is somebody that lacks too much, right? They lack too much, but the attraction is strong in the bad boy archetype because the attraction is premised on that he lacks. Whereas the nice guy archetype is somebody that doesn't lack. It is a promise of utter security, risk free, and so on, right? They know, but you see, this is why it's a boring choice. Like the nice guy is a boring choice. But also the bad boy archetype is not a good choice either because they will never have a kind of redemptive quality about them that sort of sustains the desire, right? But the trick about the bad boy archetype is that the person that is attracted to whatever archetype this is, what they're attracted to is the risk itself. The risk itself shows that something is lacking. However, what ends up happening, or what we define as a toxic relationship, is not that you are necessarily attracted to the individual, but you're attracted to the risk that the individual presents, which can only be captured in the notion of the individual. But in this sense, love is more honest in this case because love is this kind of violence. Love is the one thing that is not offered. And you see, there's so many dynamics here because the nice guy archetype is the one that is promising that he can offer everything, and he sort of puts the woman on a pedestal. But you see, to put the woman on the pedestal negates the nice guy's otherness, right? That's why it's boring, right? The woman knows that she will get served and treated right and so on. There is no risk in this idea, which feeds resentment, and now the birth of the incels are born, essentially, right? Where they always critique women for not picking the right men and so on and so on and so on. It just becomes a self-relating negativity. The nice guy becomes a self-relating negativity because he prides himself on his own standard that he is a nice guy and so on. But actually, the archetype of the nice guy and the bad boy are not really so different, really. They're not really so different because they both fully identify with the archetype, right? And this is sort of you could say the bad boy archetype is now what would be considered as like the alpha male archetype, and then nice guy archetype would probably be like beta male. I won't go into like all the other distinctions like sigma and so on, but probably sigma would be like the in between or whatever if we're using the cultural terms that are perpetuated. So anyways, again, what is attractive about let's just change it up. Let's just say that the bad boy is now the alpha male. What is attractive about the alpha male is that he lacks, right? Essentially, the woman is attractive because he presents a risk in some ways, right? He presents the risk of possibly not being with her, possibly cheating, possibly remaining in the game, playing, being with other women, lying, and so on, right? He presents that risk. But that is an attractive risk because it shows that, that it is not guaranteed that she will be loved in some ways, right? Whereas the beta archetype or the nice guy archetype, they are always guaranteeing. But the problem with the guaranteeing is that, again, you're putting the other on the pedestal, which already makes it boring. One of my favorite novels, I forgot what it was called, but it was one of the novels that Rilke recommended, ironically enough, in his what is it, Advice to Poets, is that the novel depicted this man kind of begging a woman to pick him, but she says something very powerful in this sense. She goes, "As long as you treat me like a god, I will always treat you like shit, essentially. Until you stop treating me like a god and see me as who I am, then something can emerge, basically." And this is the problem with the nice guy archetype, is that they put the woman on the pedestal and they're saying, "Oh no, you're such a goddess, you're so beautiful, you should not be treated like garbage," and so on and so on. But to be um, but they're missing a complete perverse enjoyment of this idea. Is that actually there is a kind of enjoyment where we do want to be treated like garbage because it shows um, our humanness. It shows that the person is trying to see us as we are in some aspects, right? Whether that is successful or not, it shows that we have a kind of perverse enjoyment for wanting to be seen as more human than divine figures and put it on a pedestal. But then, what is problematic about the other archetype, the more alpha male archetype, is that you are sort of the alpha male archetype sort of praises himself as a god in some sense. And so the woman that pursues him is always sort of seen lesser than human and so on. So this provides a kind of complex dynamic where you could say that the archetypes between these two, and of course, I'm kind of framing this in terms of like, women pursuing the men in this case. I'm not really nuanced in the sort of gender things, but we could probably detract the notions of gender in this case and just understand that there is a kind of archetype that perpetuates this idea, and there's another archetype that perpetuates this idea, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be a woman pursuing so and so. It can be any gender, so to speak. But because the main point of this talk is to show that actually the archetype, both archetypes, the bad boy, you could call this alpha male, and the nice guy, you could call this beta male if you want to use contemporary words again. What is both, they're both lacking. They're both archetypes that lack. But what is problematic about both of them is that the first archetype, the alpha, tends to make themselves as a god, negating the other, right? It negates the other that pursues them. The second archetype, you could say the beta male, negates themselves because they raise the other higher than themselves. So essentially, again, you have this relationship, these two archetypes that basically both negate the other in some form. They either negate themselves or they negate the other that is pursuing them. And all we want in a relationship, and this is kind of premise on Badiou and even Hegel, is that the other recognizes me as other. That this when love emerges, that it no longer becomes a one scene but a two scene, like Badiou likes to say. But you cannot ever emerge into a two scene, into a scene of two, into a scene of difference, if there's always one that is either negating himself as an other or negating the other that pursues him, and voiding them as the other, right? Preventing them from arising as another. But the perverse enjoyment of the first archetype, the one that negates the one that is pursuing them, is that the one that is pursuing them, pursuing the alpha male archetype or whatever, is that they have a perverse enjoyment for the risk that it presents, rather than the individual. What makes it toxic, what makes a relationship toxic, in my opinion, is not that you are completely fascinated by the individual. It's the fact that you are fascinated by the risk the individual presents. This is the perverse enjoyment, and that you think the risk can only be presented in this specific individual. And then the other one, the more safe option, is not worth picking because you already know in some sense how this will play out, that he will treat you good and he promised you good things and so on, that he actually treats you like a goddess or whatever, and there is no discrepancy, there is no risk. And so essentially it is boring, and most of the time women find that option unattractive, because there just is no risk being presented. There is no gap at all. But again, the first archetype is problematic because it presents too much of a gap. And so both options don't sustain attraction. At the end game, both archetypes don't sustain attraction. It never works. Um, so what sustains attraction? This is the question. Not see because dating is predicated on the epistemology that what matters is what gains. What matters to me is what is initially attractive to me. But that is not what sustains attraction. That is never what sustains attraction at all. What sustains attraction is that, in my opinion, the other has to lack just enough. It has to lack just enough. What does that mean? It lacks just enough that it feeds the attraction in general. Like, because if there's too much lacking, like the beta option, there's no attraction. And the same thing with the other option. It is also too much lacking because the other one is not willing to be committed, willing to play the game, and you want to be committed. So again, too much lack there. What sustains the attraction is that the other lacks just enough. Right? This is why, in my opinion, culture tends to vilify this term. We tend to settle. But I think there is two notions of settling. There's a sort of bad settling and there's the good settling that I want to bring up. The good settling is realizing that actually your standards for attraction are the very things that will never sustain attraction in general. So that means you have to settle. That means you have to bring down and discover what are the things that sustain the attraction. And ironically, what the things that can sustain attraction may involve letting go, releasing a given that is not supposed to be there. I have a very personal example of when my first girlfriend, when I first went on a date with her, I was not attracted to her whatsoever. It was actually her nose that bothered me a lot. I just found her completely unattractive because I was just fixated on her nose. I was like, nope, I can't be attracted to her. I hate the way her nose looks, right? But then something was said. Then I said something to myself. I said, I don't like the way her nose looks because it's not like so-and-so's. So immediately I caught myself comparing her to another person that I had recently was completely enamored with. Now, it is to me at some points inescapable that we compare the people that we start talking to or start becoming attracted to. It's inevitable that we do a kind of comparison. But it's also important that we realize that the main point of the comparison is to give up the comparison, to meet the individual on their own grounds. And once you meet the individual on this own grounds, you bring up the possibility of gaining an attraction for them. This is what I've learned in my own experience. So anyway, once I dismissed this idea that I was comparing, once I dismissed it, all of a sudden I found her very attractive. It was just all of a sudden I found her very attractive. But you see, it involved letting go of a kind of standard of oh, it's not like my ideal individual. It's not like the person that I was so in love with before previously. And it's yes, that's correct. They're not like the person there was previously. Nobody that you ever meet will be 100% like the person that you were with previously, whether they were bad to you or good to you in whatever sense. We cannot hold them to that comparison. We have to meet them on their own ground. And only when you meet them on their own ground do you start to experience the individual in the sense of possibly emerging a genuine attraction. I would say most of dating is premised on a sort of synthetic attraction, meaning we are just premising attraction based off of what initially attracts me, right? For example, at least speaking for men, right? Big tits, all that stuff. Yeah, sure. It attracts me. Sure. But it doesn't sustain the attraction. And so what that means is that it raises the possibility that a woman not having any of those physical qualities can still attract me, because ultimately at the end of the day, none of those things really truly sustain the attraction. It's something else that sustains the attraction. Um, but of course, there's a balance. What does that mean? It means that they have to lack just enough. It and typically this is captured with the comment or the famous um, trope of opposites attract. But for me, this is not an adequate, no longer an adequate understanding of opposites attract, because the underlying logic of opposites attract is that actually, because you cannot be too opposite. If you are too opposite, then the attraction doesn't exist. You have to be opposite just enough that sustains the attraction. Um, And of course, in order to discover this just enough, you have to possibly even relinquish some of your idealizations about love and what it should be like and so on. Instead, you should have this groundless moment. And this is why I always say love is the one thing not offered, because initial attraction is exactly that thing, that it is the initial offering. Look, my looks are the initial offering, my personality is the initial offering. But what really sustains the attraction is what is not offered, right? It's what is not offered between the two of you that sustains the attraction. And love is possible to emerge within that sustaining of attraction. It sort of defies historical contingency in some sense, because no longer am I concerned about how she's going to look when she's older, or whether she ages, or whether she, no longer has the aesthetic pleasures that I enjoy or something like that. It starts becoming immediately way more than those things. Um, and so it definitely becomes this idea of that she lacks just enough. And this is, to me, this is the idea of being perfect for each other. That perfection is not that the other satisfies every single thing on the market or every single thing off your list. It's perfection is they lack just enough, right? It's not too much, it's not too little. They lack just enough. This is perfection for me. Um, and this is what sustains attraction, in my opinion, that the other lacks just enough. Um, and typically, we kind of term this as settling, right? Because women say, "Well, he's not that attractive, but his personality really, blah blah blah." But this semi unattractiveness is also the lack that is just enough to sustain the relationship. Because of the personality as well, right? The personality and the looks combined, he's not so that the person is not so hideously unattractive that nothing can perpetuate, but they are unattractive just enough that the personality sort of carries it through. You know what I mean? Like, it is kind of like that. And typically, I think dating culture has this idea of, oh, that's settling. I don't think that's settling at all. I think settling is actually the opposite. Settling is this idea that settling is a self identity kind of issue, right? That I am settling, I don't want to settle because of my worth and so on. But love negates that idea of settling. Love is the emergence of the two. So you cannot settle in that sense. But you would be settling if you know that you are not actually in love. So I feel like the opposite actually happens to a lot of people. Their enforcement of their own ideologies of love and standards is exactly them settling. They are preventing themselves from the possible emergence of love from happening because they don't want any lack. They want the person to check off everything off the list. They don't want any red flags. And so there's something about red flags that is interesting, in my opinion, that actually, you're right. The person can't have too many red flags because maybe they're a serial killer. Maybe they will kill you. Um, but they need to have just enough red flags that it sustains the attraction. You know what I mean? They can't have, because this is the culture that we live in, right? If they have no red flags, then the person falls into some type of like suspicion, like this is impossible. How is this person so perfect? And if you are so perfect, then it prevents the other from pursuing you. I actually have a personal story on this too, where verbatim, my ex said to me in a sort of breakup text message, she was like, "Hey, um, you are just too good to me, right? You are too good." So here you immediately see that I am too perfect, too good to even sustain the relationship. Um, and this is symptomatic everywhere, where the partner feels like they are lower than the other because the other is just so up there, so perfect, so whatever. And this makes it difficult to sustain the attraction. Of course, you can say, oh, these are just confidence issues. But in my opinion, yes, they can be confidence issues, but also it shows that the other has not shown that they lack in some ways, right? That they need to show some type of lack. Um, and this is where honesty can make a kind of pivotal point in relationship making, because the point of honesty, in my opinion, is not to show that you're being honest to simply share a virtue of character, but you're sharing honesty because you're trying to show that you lack, right? That, look, I am like this. That is my honest take because I am like this. So there is definitely a kind of, I hate the word balance, but there is a kind of equalization that is needed in order to sustain attraction. And it is this idea of you have to lack just enough. Because if the other lacks too much, then you can't sustain it. It's not possible to sustain the relationship in general. Um, and if you lack too much in comparison to the other, then again, the phenomenological symptoms is that you feel guilty that you can't live up to what the other is. You start doubting whether this person actually, is who they are, and all this other stuff. So it's super dynamical in the sense that you have to find this idea of we lack just enough. But the person that feels that the other is too perfect is actually more problematic of the fact that they have put them on a pedestal of thought. That this person is so good, so perfect, they cannot possibly treat me wrong, and yet me, I'm so minute and small, imperfection, so on. Like, no. The point is that they're still not seeing the other as other. To see the other as other is to see that you are in the same position as me, meaning that both you and I lack the same thing, that we lack just enough. We lack just enough to be other. If you don't lack just enough to be other, then you're no longer other. You are either less than other, treated like garbage, or treat yourself like garbage, or you're more than other, think yourself as God, a kind of like godlike personality, or the other person praises you up like a god. So this is the dynamic. But in my opinion, just to play on the trope of nice guys finish last, is that the nice guy that finished last is the guy that lacks just enough. He has to lack just enough. That actually the nice guy that is typically represented in the nice guys finish last is the guy of security and promise and no risk, right? This is why they say the trope nice guys finish last, because basically they're trying to represent some type of feminine consciousness about how the woman will pursue the toxic guy, and then after a repetition of failures, she'll finally settle for the nice guy and then live her life happily ever after, right? And so nice guys finish last. But actually, in my opinion, that is a wrong depiction. It's actually not the nice guy, at least it's not that depiction of a nice guy that actually finishes last. Because no one will ever pursue that person because he has no genuine representation of lack or privation. He has only promise and full security, which we think is what we want. But actually, we want a kind of lack that is just enough, because lack represents some type of risk. And you need risk for the ground of trust, for the ground of love. You need some element of the fact of like, love always demands this type of repetition of committing, that yes, I am committed to you. And so in the void or in the gap of this risk, I have to take the leap and constantly commit and promise that I am with you. Um, it cannot be this one time I promise everything, because then that's boring. But then the other side is also never going to promise anything. So it's a kind of risk that nullifies itself, because you can never sustain anything with it. Um, so the notion of nice guy finished last that I am presenting here is actually a combination of the archetypes, but it is essentially to be the bad boy who lacks. And this is just to play on the trope, not that we have to perpetuate any image or archetype, but it's to simply be honest, to be honest liars about the fact that we lack. We lack in some type of discrepancy. And to meet the other on their ground, rather than on the ideological level of what we want the individual to be like. Um, and this is not an easy thing to do, but you can, if you ever get a chance to try it, you can see how attraction actually changes. That attraction itself is not something so ingrained, like you can't help that you're only attracted to skinny people or something like that. It actually involves a reworking and releasing of something in order to find something attractive. It's funny because attraction actually works by subtraction. You actually have to subtract something to sustain an attraction. It's not that you can't sustain attraction by everything being everything you wanted being added, presented. It's not possible. It doesn't sustain it. You have initial attraction, yes, but it doesn't sustain it. There's nothing that sustains it. There has to be something that is subtractive that sustains the attraction. Um, and so, yes, so I think, so obviously risk, because love has no guarantees, right? Love is the one thing not offered. This is my constant repetition of this. And yet it demands an offering. And this is the risk, right? That you have to offer something. You have to put something on the table, even though you know love is the one thing that cannot be offered. But we're ultimately attracted to this idea, this risk making that we have to make. And again, just to recap, the only thing that makes a toxic relationship toxic is not realizing that we're having a sort of enjoyment about the risk rather than the individual. So that means that we're equating the enjoyment of the risk with the individual. And that's what makes it toxic, because what ends up happening is that you keep repeating, you keep returning to the same individual because you enjoy not the individual, which is the typical assumption, but actually you enjoy the risk of what's presented by that individual. But what's hard to discern is that, or what's hard to argue for other people that have this problem, is that the risk itself is not tied to the individual. That you can actually encounter a risk without it being necessarily that individual, hence breaking the sort of toxic repetition that is presented in the relationship. But yes, I do think there is still a perverse enjoyment for risk, which to me is the more honest take on love, rather than the other side, where it tries to try to present to you this idea that there is no risk, you never needed to take a risk. This is typically embodied in the archetype of the nice guy, that there is no risk with me, I can promise you everything, and so on. But the one thing that the nice guy cannot promise is risk. That's the irony about it all, and that's actually the very thing that doesn't sustain the desire, or sustain the attraction for the other person pursuing him. But fundamentally, also, don't get it twisted. if we present ourselves honestly in the idea that, yes, I'm a human being that lacks to some degree, then you can see that you don't need to make any promises or anything. It is really about letting go in some ways, that almost sustains the attraction. That, look, this is what I am, whether it be through societal forces, the unconscious, everything else. This is what has been created, this identity, this me. Um, and if that is what is attractive, then that is the lacking portion that sustains the attraction. Um, so yeah, but there's a lot there. I'm hoping to eventually write about this. Um, but yeah, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed it. All right, take care. Bye.